What is up, guys? So today I want to talk about a topic that has come up in a few of my recent videos. If you saw the video I made with Abel and Steve Hall on if we would use gear or steroids, it was also mentioned in my interview with John Meadows and how it's affected his life and his bodybuilding career. And then I also mentioned the LetsGetChecked.com, where you can get hormone testing as well as other blood work done. And I mentioned a link below, which I'll put here as well, just in case you guys are interested in having your own tests done. But basically, it's obviously a very popular topic in YouTube fitness, in the bodybuilding community. Both the enhanced and natural bodybuilding community seems particularly interested in this topic. And so while we talked about if we would do it, we talked about, your own levels, and we talked about, if like you're talking to a professional bodybuilder and how it's affected them. Here, I wanted to talk about if I think you, as a listener, as a recreational lifter, or as a serious lifter, should be taking steroids or considering taking steroids. Now, I will say I would want to distinguish this between legitimate TRT, testosterone replacement therapy, or HRT, hormone replacement therapy. I do have several clients who are on TRT. I have talked to many people who are on hormone replacement therapy. And if you have a legitimate medical need for it, I think it definitely makes sense to take it, especially if you have very low levels where your life can really be hampered by those low levels. I think it's totally fine. Obviously, under the supervision of a physician, you'd want to have blood work before, of course, to confirm if you have hypogonadism, and then you would want a doctor monitoring you. So that is different than what I'm talking about here, which would be basically recreational use of anabolic steroids. Now, there's not going to be a perfectly right or wrong answer here for you. If you are an individual considering it, you have to consider all of the information that is given to you anecdotally and what's in the research. I can only tell you what I've seen in people who use them, what the evidence shows, and there is a lot of evidence out there. You have a lot of studies out there on short-term and longer-term use of anabolic steroids, and so that's kind of what I want to talk about today. Now, in one of my other videos, we had a commenter mention how he thinks that anybody who uses them is foolish unless the example that was given was a serious athlete like Mike Israetel. And I want to circle back to athletics and athletes later, but when you're talking about something like that, I think there's such a blurry line between what makes somebody an athlete nowadays and what makes somebody just a recreational lifter. Because before, it was okay, you are either professionally paid to do something or you are just a casual. And now you have people, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has gotten really big. These kind of amateur bodybuilding competitions and powerlifting competitions have gotten really big where people are considering themselves athletes, but they're not really making any money from it. And so, as somebody like Mike Israetel, who does not make money from bodybuilding, who has actually only done one bodybuilding competition and, was not happy with his performance there. And I don't know if he currently competes in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but regardless, he's certainly not making money from either of those endeavors. And he's certainly not a professional athlete. So I don't think one could say, well, because he competes, he's a serious athlete and he can use it, but somebody who doesn't compete shouldn't. I really think that argument does not hold water, and I will kind of elaborate on that further. So obviously, this is an individual decision for everybody to make. I think the majority, certainly not all, but the majority of people who have been lifting for a long time, especially if they've gotten to a point where they're not really making a lot of progress, have considered using some sort of enhancement, whether that is steroids or even just, when you're first looking into supplements and you're thinking, wow, this is really going to have this huge effect. And you start going down that path. And it can be kind of a murky path when you look at things like designer steroids, pro hormones, things that historically have been sold at supplement shops, but actually have very powerful effects. When you're talking about that, you consider, well, this is just one step up from creatine. If you're not educated on the topic, you might think, well, I started with creatine and then I took Super Pump 250 and now I'm just trying some Super Droll and, it's just the next level thing. And you might, some of these people, especially these teenagers or college students, they might not really know what they're getting into. And so it just seems a blurry line. Whereas, obviously something that's an injectable, you think, okay, now that's serious. But in reality, some of these oral over-the-counter, what was previously over-the-counter drugs can be very, very powerful, even more powerful than, let's say, like a base testosterone or something like that as a beginner cycle. So the first thing I would say is you obviously have to get educated. And educated does not mean, oh, well, I read forums, or, oh, I have a friend who does it. One of the main things that I've noticed is that, honestly, and I realize how judgmental this sounds, but a lot of people who use steroids are frankly just morons, in my opinion. And I've known so many, high school or college athletes who have used them, and just hearing them talk about it is kind of unbelievable to me, where I will hear them talk about how they know it has no side effects for them, but they've never had blood work done. How they know it's this or that, but they can't even pronounce the names. There's a MMA commentator who I actually like quite a bit. I like his videos, but he couldn't even pronounce gynecomastia. He was saying it completely wrong. And this is a guy who literally calls himself an expert on the topic of steroids, who used them for years, and clearly from how he talks about them doesn't even know the basics. And you have people who simply do them because their friends do them. I have several friends of my own who would literally do steroids if somebody got them the steroids, but won't do it on their own. But if they had a friend who did it, or they had somebody just deliver it to them, they would do it, because they're just willing to take that risk without being educated. And that is probably the number one issue I see. I mean, from the people who I know who have taken them, almost none of them are truly educated on the topic. Obviously you have people like Greg Doucette, who seems like he's pretty educated on it. You have somebody like a Mike Israetel. These are the people who you're seeing out there in the social media world. I mean, obviously there are plenty of people in social media world who are not educated, but you have people like them who seem educated on it. But the average gym rat who's doing them generally is not. So that's probably my biggest warning to people, is if you're even considering it, get educated. Now, as I mentioned for my own journey in this, I was lifting for probably 7 years before I even had the thought of it. And then I did a lot of research. I had a lot of tests on myself. I realized that I had a heart condition, might be genetic, I'm not sure. But that was enough for me to kind of put the brakes on there. For somebody else, maybe they test completely clear on everything and they decide that it's worth it for them. In hindsight, I'm glad that I'm not currently just blasting a bunch of steroids for further reasons that I will elaborate on. But, I can't say that if somebody has done all of their research and they make that decision, that they're wrong for doing so. Obviously, there are potential consequences if you go down that path. One of the things that we had discussed in the most recent podcast, that roundtable, was some of those consequences. Obviously, a lot of people know about infertility. If you want to have kids later, now you can certainly get that back when you come off the steroids. A lot of time, you look at Ronnie Coleman, he has 8 kids. You look at Arnold Schwarzenegger, he has several kids, even he's had accident kids. So obviously, it's not exactly like a perfect birth control, but that is something to consider. Obviously, it can cause balding, acne, bloating. A lot of people know about these issues, but they might not know about certain things like neurological issues that can happen. Everybody talks about the roid rage, but there is some evidence to show that it can actually really change your behavior and your mindset. And, that can affect your relationships, that can affect your life. There's a lot that you have to consider, and some of those might be changes that can't be undone. They might be permanent changes that you have to deal with. Not all of them, but there does seem to be some evidence that there are permanent neurological issues that can take place. Probably one of the biggest reasons that I'm glad that I didn't really decide to go down that route and push things like I see some people on social media do is the fact that I don't think, you're certainly not going to ever really hit the peak levels that you did while taking steroids. Again, I know plenty of people who have taken them. I think we all know people who are clearly on them, and you see them on a cycle and then you see them off a cycle, and there's a dramatic difference a lot of the time. And for me, I think it's already hard for me when I look back at like a peak that I was at, and I think, man, because of some of the health issues that I've had, I can't get back to that. And I also know that even though I'm only 28, that when I'm 40, it's probably going to be a little bit worse. And when I'm 50, it's going to be a little bit worse. And certainly, if you are a natural lifter, you can maintain the majority of your progress for many decades. But there's obviously still going to be a slow decline, as with everybody who ages. And so that's already something that you have to deal with. But you see a lot of these professional bodybuilders who cannot let go of that. They are 30, 40 pounds lighter than they used to be at a similar leanness. And I would imagine that that really dramatically affects one's psyche. And if you look at how they identify themselves, they were always the big bodybuilder, and almost all of them have issues trying to be something else. Whereas, if you're, let's say, 200 pounds and now in your later years you're 190 or even 185, you probably still look relatively similar. If you look at a Jeff Alberts, he really is as big at 50 as he was at 30. And when he's 60, he'll probably be smaller, but he probably won't be that much smaller. And I think for me, that is one of the biggest reasons that it's something that you really have to consider if that's something you can handle. It's kind of like the slow and steady or the burn bright, but then, you just kind of crash after that. And you look at some of these guys who at 25 and 30, they look godlike. And then by 35, 40, it's just like, what has happened to that person? And that's a choice that, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's what you want to do, as long as you understand that. That's probably the main thing that I'm going to keep going back to, is you need to understand what happens, because a lot of people are doing it for a very short-term gain, and they're not considering what could happen down the road. So obviously, just from hearing me talk for the last 10 minutes or so, I think you get the point that for the most part, I would recommend almost everybody to not do it. I don't think there's any problem with getting educated on the topic. Obviously, I would consider myself fairly educated after all the research I did on them. But I think for the large majority of people, it makes sense to stay a natural lifter, to do the best you can. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't put everything into it. I think you should, if this is a passion of yours, push as hard as you can for a certain period of time and see what you can get out of it. But I just think for most people, the consequences, the costs, the risks are not worth it. But I'm not saying that nobody should do it. So, for example, who would I say should potentially consider, or not even should, but I would say it makes more sense. I think if you are a top level athlete and you have the potential to be great, I could see an argument for that. Not even getting into the morality of steroids in sports, because obviously they are rampant in sports, but I could easily see if you were a great college athlete and you needed steroids to become a professional, highly, highly paid athlete, I could absolutely understand why that would be worth it for somebody. If you are a movie actor and going and taking steroids and putting on 20 pounds of muscle for a role that you have in the next year is going to get you that role and millions of dollars and fandom and whatever else you're looking for out of your career, I can again completely understand why somebody would do that. Lastly, if you are a natural trainee and you've really put everything into it and you've really educated yourself on the topic, and like I said, I think this is where I think maybe a Mike Isertel or a Jared Feather falls in there, where yes, they are going to compete, but they trained very hard for a long time as a natural, and they made that jump. And you know what? They might take years off their life. And the other thing you have to consider is, this is something I mentioned before, there are people who don't just take a couple years off their life. They could take, decades off their life. If you have, I know somebody who had a rare clotting disorder, and that was apparent once he was on steroids. He had a heart attack. He probably took 30 plus years off his life. So you have to be prepared for that. But, somebody like Mike is not going to be a professional actor. He's not going to be a professional athlete. He'll compete, but will he even go pro? Who knows, as far as bodybuilding goes. But for him, it's his passion. Now, you could argue it also helps him with Renaissance periodization. But the thing is, it's his passion, and he's obviously an educated guy. He's made that decision, and I really think that's completely fine and reasonable. It's his life, and he's decided what he wants to do. And I mean, I'm not even saying that like with a certain tone in my voice, like I actually think it's a problem. I truly believe that for him, if he's like making that decision, his wife is a medical doctor. I really personally don't see any problem with that at all. But again, he is in the minority there of people who have come to that decision with good context and good natural training for years and everything that goes into that. But again, if you're a professional athlete, if you're a movie star or something like that, I think it does make sense. And obviously you can see a lot of these movie stars do end up taking steroids, and you can see how they look during a movie, and then you can see how they look 6 months later. And it's kind of shocking to see those transformations. Obviously a lot of the time they'll just say it's because they were training 4 hours a day and eating 6,000 calories and 8 meals and all that nonsense. But I think it's pretty clear that there are a decent number of movie stars and actors and maybe even some actresses who take steroids. So anyway, guys, I don't want to ramble too much longer here. I just kind of wanted to put that into more of a concise format for the people, because I've had people ask me, either clients or just people who I talk to, just ask me about steroids. If I, think it makes sense for them to do it. And almost always I say no, but I wanted to actually put my thoughts out here for people who are interested. And any questions you might have, comment them down below. I'd really appreciate if you guys thumbed up the video. If you want to see more videos like this or more podcasts, go ahead and subscribe. And again, I'll put that link down below for anybody interested in getting their own blood work done. Things like testosterone, estrogen, lipid, which would be like cholesterol panels, anything like that you're interested in is offered in that link. So if you want to support the channel, feel free to click there and use my coupon code as well. Thanks, guys.